One of the things about this show that has just been so tremendous is just like every time I sit down with a poet, I learn something new. I mean, it just nourishes me as a human being, these conversations with poets.
This is Just to Say, conversations with poets about the poems they create and the poems that created them. Hosted by Texas Poet Laureate Carrie Fountain. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has multiple legal challenges and now multiple challengers for his seat within his party. Today on The Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm Laura Rice, in for David Brown. Texas college sports bring in big money. What's a unanimous Supreme Court decision yesterday mean for athlete compensation? Texas has lost more rural hospitals recently than any other state. So what's that mean in an emergency? Plus, dozens of Texas prisoners set for release or parole have died behind bars in the past year or so. A new study gets behind the delays. And one Texas prison is cleared out to hold migrants. We'll examine what issues might arise. All that examining unidentified phenomena and more today on The Standard. A high of 89 today in Midland, 85 in Tyler, 92 in Pharr. It's the Texas Standard for Tuesday, June 22nd. I'm Laura Rice, in for David Brown. Noticeably cooler weather across much of the state after some storms passed through, but things are still heating up in Texas politics. The water seems to be boiling for Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who faces legal challenges on multiple fronts and now is also facing multiple political challengers from his own party. Former Texas Supreme Court Justice Eva Guzman officially announced her candidacy for Attorney General yesterday. She's the second Republican after Land Commissioner George P. Bush also announced a campaign against Paxton. And she's already received some endorsements. The Political Action Committee Texans for Lawsuit Reform came out in her support. But with now 3 Republicans in that race, can Guzman gain the attention of everyday voters? Renee Cross is Senior Director of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. She's been keeping an eye on Paxton's mounting challengers. Professor Cross, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Tell us about Eva Guzman's political history. She just stepped down from the Texas Supreme Court after serving for how long?
She served at the Supreme Court for 11 years, but her legal experience extends over 2 decades. And very impressive woman. I mean, she has an incredibly poignant success story growing up in Houston's East End in a family of 9. She worked at a factory sewing draperies while a teenager to help her family and to save money for college. She was the first in her family to go to college, which was the University of Houston. Later went to South Texas School of Law, got her law degree, and also got a master's degree from Duke University. She practiced law in her own firm before running for district court judge in Harris County. Governor Rick Perry appointed her to the Texas Supreme Court in 2009. She ran in 2010. And then in 2016, she actually garnered the most votes of anyone on a statewide race at the time, with nearly 5 million votes. Again, success story from high school on.
Yeah, so an impressive personal history. What about her politics? The thing about being in the legal industry is you have, a sort of a record of decisions. What do we know about that as far as Justice Guzman goes?
Well, she certainly has experience in both civil and criminal courts, and she has authored a number of opinions. So she's got a long, lengthy legal career that I think will contrast nicely with that of George P. Bush and Ken Paxton.
So for conservative voters looking for an alternative to Paxton, is there anything that Guzman brings to the table that might make her more attractive than George P. Bush?
Well, I think first off, she has proven to be a coalition builder, as we saw in 2016 when she garnered almost 5 million votes in Texas. Republicans who may have been embarrassed by Paxton over the last few years, I think would be attracted to her. That, at least at this point, appears to have a very clean record, both professionally and personally. Suburban voters in particular that may not have voted for President Trump in 2020 may be attracted to her, especially women. I mean, after all, she's a suburban mom now living in Cypress outside of Houston. She's also most likely going to be very attractive to conservative Latinos in South Texas. As we saw in 2020, an increased number of Latinos did vote for President Trump. So she may have an edge there. And again, just going back to her very impressive personal and professional experience, I think certainly helps her.
Well, the focus in this AG's race so far has been on the Republican primary side. On the Democratic side, civil rights attorney Lee Merritt and former Galveston Mayor Joe Jaworski have also announced campaigns. Are those candidates worth keeping an eye on?
Well, I think so. Now they're much lesser known than any of the three top Republican contenders. However, I think the Democrats will have a strong push next year, even though traditionally a midterm year is not favorable to the party in presidential power. But Joe Jaworski is very well liked among Democrats. I think the major hurdle for both him and Lee Merritt is just name recognition. And, they're starting way behind.
Renee Cross is Senior Director of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. Professor Cross, thanks again for speaking with us.
Thanks.
Universities around the country make millions every year on their sports programs. So should student athletes reap some of those financial rewards? The U.S. Supreme Court yesterday announced a unanimous decision against the National Collegiate Athletic Association. It's a ruling some are calling a win for student athletes, though a narrow one. Eric Kelderman is a senior reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Eric, good to talk with you.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity.
For some background, could you set up the NCAA's argument against paying student athletes?
Sure. The NCAA argues that college athletes are amateurs, and what makes college sports special is that they are not paid. And further, that they need to enforce uniform restrictions on compensation for athletes so that there's an even playing field for all the colleges that are competing in the NCAA.
So this case didn't examine that full argument. What did it decide?
Well, what it really decided was whether the restrictions that the NCAA places on what colleges are allowed to offer athletes, which is a scholarship, the cost of attendance, whether that violated federal antitrust laws, whether in fact the NCAA is a special enterprise that's allowed to essentially depress the wages of its athletes, who are not actually employees, of course. And in that decision, the court found that the NCAA can't really do that, at least not entirely.
Should we read anything into the fact that this was a unanimous decision by the court?
Yeah, I think a little bit in that, all the justices in the questioning around this case were very skeptical of the NCAA's arguments, really questioned this idea that amateurism was something special to the NCAA that needed to be preserved by not paying athletes. And I think it sends a strong message that the NCAA has to be very careful in this area. And they're being challenged in a number of other ways, of course. As you know, in Texas, the name, image, likeness law goes into effect, I believe, in July. And that will allow student athletes to make deals, essentially endorsement deals or social influencers on social media, things like that. And that was another area where they had decided that athletes couldn't participate in those sorts of arrangements because of this idea of amateurism.
So does it seem like the court has an appetite for hearing more of these cases, some that may go further?
That's true. It was a unanimous decision, but Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote a concurring opinion that seemed to suggest that there might be further challenges available to student athletes, and that could have far-ranging effects in terms of actually allowing colleges to, for instance, pay their athletes or share the revenue from, for instance, television deals, things like that. That's not allowed under this current rule. So under the current ruling, colleges can pay what are called education-related benefits. They could provide scholarships for graduate study or computers or vocational training of some sort, but they can't actually pay the athletes a check. But, down the road, I think there is a possibility that athletes will continue to challenge these restrictions because of the enormous amounts of money that are flowing to athletic departments, conferences, and the NCAA itself, primarily through television contracts, but also ticket sales, bowl appearances, things like that.
Is there anyone besides the NCAA pushing back on this or raising concerns?
Certainly, I think within the community there are concerns, even among advocates, about the possibility of abuses here. So, would an athletic booster, for instance, provide some sort of internship to an athlete for a no-show job, right? Something that isn't really legitimate. As an inducement, for instance, to play, would they offer those sorts of benefits to recruits? And that's, I think, where will really start to play out is in the recruitment of athletes to elite schools and what schools decide they can offer to their top prospects.
Eric Kelderman is a senior reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Eric, thanks again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Wells Dunbar is watching the conversation online. He's our social media editor. Wells, welcome.
Hi, Laura. We've been talking about Governor Abbott's vetoes on the program this week, particularly his legally questionable defunding of the Texas legislature. Another Abbott veto that we've mentioned on air continuing to take on a life of its own on social media, and that would be the governor's veto of bipartisan legislation forbidding the use of heavy chains to restrain dogs outside. As the Houston Chronicle reports, Twitter has responded with the hashtag Abbott hates dogs. Ouch. The governor claims that the veto was about combating government micromanagement, but on our Facebook page, John Davis isn't buying that. He says micromanaging, that's the excuse. In the meantime, the state tells women how to manage their health, businesses are prevented from making their own mask rules, and sports teams are forced to play the national anthem. Interesting rebuke there. Laura, in more palatable news, we're hearing about a reprieve for a certain Texas restaurant chain. That would be Luby's, who found a buyer, thereby saving many of its locations from liquidation. We're going to have folks' responses about that and other stories from social media later in the program.
A lot of Luby's fans on this and this Texas Standard staff, I've got to say. So we will be hearing, I'm sure, from some of you on that. You can always share your thoughts on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. You can also email us directly, texasstandard@kut.org. We'll be right back.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas CASA, advocating for a safe and positive future for all Texas children in the child protection system. Volunteer information at becomeacasa.org. Every child has a chance. It's you.
It is the season for sneezing.
And if you need to curse, all you have to yell is, "Dim it!"
Real Texans want enchiladas.
So let's all have a tipple of eggnog to wet our beaks.
Any idea works for a poem. Send yours to the Texas Standard team and listen anytime on the Typewriter Rodeo podcast.
This is the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice. Throughout the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines across Texas, Presidio County residents have turned out by the thousands, leading the state's vaccination efforts. Now the West Texas County has reached a new significant benchmark. Marfa Public Radio's Carlos Morales has more.
The latest data from the Texas Department of State Health Services shows 99% of Presidio County residents 12 years and older have now received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. That's well beyond the statewide average, which is closer to about 57%. But the state says there is a discrepancy in the data. The listed vaccination rate for Presidio County may be misleading because Presidio County actually has, quote, more residents than was estimated in the data used to calculate the vaccination rate. Despite the discrepancy, the state says Presidio County is still near the top of counties with the most vaccinated residents. And locally, officials are lauding the milestone and the efforts taken to vaccinate this rural corner of the state. I'm Carlos Morales in Marfa.
Support for coverage of business comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a safety-focused workers' comp provider committed to protecting employees in a wide range of industries across Texas. More at texasmutual.com.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. Rural Texas has a hospital problem. In the last 10 years across the United States, 136 small-town hospitals have shuttered, and Texas has been hit the hardest, according to American public media. So what happens to residents in those communities when an emergency strikes and critical care is far away? Texas Tech Public Media's Jamie Lozano takes us to one small town that is feeling the pain of life without a hospital.
The drive from Lubbock has been a pretty straight shot, but it's also just been a really long stretch of road with some small towns few and far in between. The town seems like it stays pretty isolated as far as its surrounding goes until you really get into town.
I drive past miles and miles of cattle ranches and open, rocky terrain, and not much else. I'm more than an hour northwest of Fort Worth when I finally enter Bowie, Texas. I can't miss it.
It does eventually lead to the Welcome to Bowie sign and the world's largest Bowie knife in front of it. Let's stop here and check out why they decided to put this Bowie knife here.
The nearly 21-foot knife statue sits on the edge of town as a reliable landmark. It's always here. But for years, Bowie has struggled with one major area of instability, its healthcare system.
So we jumped in the car, flew to the hospital. At that point, his color was gray, turning blue. He was projectile vomiting. I knew it was a heart attack, but I didn't know how bad it was.
Back in 2019, Ramona Matthews Polk was having lunch with her husband, Randy, when he told her that he was having a heart attack. The closest hospitals were in neighboring towns 30 minutes away, so she took him to a standalone emergency room 2 blocks down the street.
The doctor stopped me and said, "Have you ever heard of the Widowmaker?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Your husband is actively having the Widowmaker heart attack."
Randy was 56 at the time. His blood pressure was dangerously high. 258 over 197.
And when I looked up and saw that blood pressure of 258 over 197, I knew his heart was about to explode. The Widowmaker is the worst heart attack you can have. Your heart literally explodes. 99 times out of 100, you don't live.
The doctors at the ER were able to get his blood pressure down, but Ramona says he needed a full-service hospital. Randy was then airlifted to a hospital outside of Bowie.
10 years, they say that normally you can't have another one. And, it's been 2 years now. I pray every day that he never has another one. But if he does, he won't make it because we don't have a hospital or anywhere to go to.
The small town is now without a local hospital or the emergency room that saved Randy's life that day. Bowie is just one of many small communities that has lost its hospital. According to data from American Public Media Research Lab, Texas has seen the most hospital closures in the U.S. 24 have closed in the Lone Star State alone in the past 16 years.
It is not going to be possible to start at this hospital again. It was a wonderful rural hospital. We had good physicians. We had 2 general surgeons. We did a lot of surgery. We took care of a lot of people.
Former hospital administrator Lynn Heller was hired to help keep Bowie's hospital open. When he left the hospital in 1994, yearly expenses for unpaid bills, amongst other things, was about $280,000. When he returned in May 2015, he was shocked to see some of those expenses had ballooned to $4.8 million.
The hospital was struggling because people weren't paying their bills, and the government weren't paying what they should be paying to the hospitals and to doctors.
Some patients couldn't afford to pay, and government funding for Medicare had been slashed. There weren't many options left to keep it open.
And I remember him saying several times that because Medicare was reducing funding, that there will be a point in time when we need to have a tax district.
Bert Cunningham is the city manager of Bowie and remembers Lynn sounding the alarm a long time ago.
I remember, and this is probably 30 or 40 years ago, when Lynn was the administrator of the hospital, he would go around town to service clubs and different organizations telling about the hospital and what was going on and what they were doing and whatnot.
A proposal was made to raise property taxes by 17 cents per $100 in property value for residents. The taxes would then be used to help fund and keep the hospital open.
So here we go again. Someone in Montague County wants your hard-earned money. And they've tried this before, but they failed.
Back in 2015, some residents that opposed the tax increase led social media campaigns encouraging others to vote against it.
Vote no, and together we'll reconstruct Bowie to serve us.
The residents of Bowie voted against the tax increase, and soon after, the hospital closed.
People are still mourning its loss, and it's just a sad day that the people didn't understand what an asset that they had there. It was one of the saddest days of my life when the hospital closed.
So I'm outside Bowie Memorial Hospital, where it doesn't seem to have really been landscaped in quite a while. It's a little weird. The front doors of the hospital still have the notices stating that it would be closing temporarily and then saying that it had just closed. In the past 5 years, Bowie Hospital has closed twice. Now, it would be too expensive to reopen.
It is super scary living in a city with absolutely positively no hospital, no standing ER, no nothing. It's very, very scary. Who wants to retire in a town where there's no medical facility?
Ramona and Randy thought that they would stay here for the long haul, but now they have to reconsider. Doctors say Randy will have another heart attack in the next 8 years, so the clock is running. I'm Jamie Lozano in Lubbock.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Center for Proton Therapy, offering precision proton radiation treatment for many types of cancer. More at texasprotons.com. Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas College Savings Plan, administered by the state of Texas. Families can save for tuition, room and board, books, and other qualified education expenses at eligible schools nationwide. Learn more at texascollegesavings.com.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Joseph Leahy. Texas ranks 46th in the nation for child well-being based on factors such as health and education. That's according to an annual report from the Annie E. Casey Foundation released Monday. Amy Knopp-Narbutis is with the think tank Every Texan, which collaborated on the study that found more than 1.4 million Texas children were in poverty in 2019.
That was about 1 in 5 kids, which is an improvement from a decade ago, when 1 in 4 kids was in poverty in Texas. However, there are equity gaps around this. Today, still 1 in 4 Black and Hispanic children experiences poverty.
Texas also had the highest number of uninsured kids in 2019. Democratic Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Austin is introducing legislation to allow local governments in Texas offer Medicaid to more low-income residents. KUT's Ashley Lopez reports Texas lawmakers have refused to expand the program, even though most states, including conservative ones, have already done so.
The measure would allow local entities to decide whether they want to expand healthcare insurance to more people, mostly to their working poor. Doggett says this isn't an effort to circumvent Texas officials. He says if big cities expand coverage, it could convince state lawmakers that Medicaid expansion is worth pursuing.
This is really an incentive to demonstrate how this can work
And in our urban areas, we can cover most of those who are Medicaid eligible, but ultimately we hope the state will come in and see it works, that it's economically beneficial and certainly beneficial to a healthy workforce.
It's estimated that as many as 2 million Texans could gain health care coverage through Medicaid expansion. About 75% of the eligible population are people of color. Doggett says if just Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio were to decide to expand coverage, that would cover about half of the state population that would be eligible.
Ashley Lopez reporting. The U.S. borders with Mexico and Canada will remain closed to non-essential traffic through at least July 21st. The Department of Homeland Security extended the restrictions Sunday due to the pandemic. And country music Hall of Famer and South Texas native Chris Christopherson turns 85 years old today. His major hits include Me and Bobby McGee, as well as the title track of his 2013 album Feeling Mortal.
Wide awake and feeling mortal at this moment in the dream. That old man there in the mirror and my shaky self-esteem.
The former Rhodes Scholar and Army captain was born in Brownsville, Texas. I'm Joseph Leahy for the Texas Standard.
You're listening to statewide news from public radio stations across Texas. This coverage is only possible because of support from listeners like you. You can help sustain and grow Texas news coverage by donating to your local public radio station.
33 minutes past the hour Texas Standard Time. I'm Laura Rice in for David Brown. Roughly 9% of the Texas prison population, that's more than 10,000 people, are behind bars despite having been approved for release or parole. A new report reveals how COVID-19 and subsequent lockdowns with the prison system have created so many delays in releasing those approved for parole that some prisoners have actually died waiting. Michelle Deitch is one of the authors of the report. She's an attorney and a distinguished senior lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the University of Texas School of Law. Michelle, welcome back to the Texas Standard.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell me what your report looked at exactly.
We were analyzing deaths in custody that occurred among people who had been approved for parole in Texas prisons, but died before they were ever able to walk out the prison gates. And we were trying to analyze the reasons that they died and whether this was something that was peculiar to the COVID era or whether it was something that was really more systemic and had preceded COVID.
So from March 2020 to March 2021, you found 42 prisoners approved for parole died waiting. How did you determine that, and could there be even more your study did not capture?
We were looking at deaths in custody reports that had been filed with the Office of the Attorney General and comparing that data to information from high-value data sets that the prison agency had maintained. We believe that this is the minimum number of deaths that had occurred. There were definitely some that we may have missed. But yes, there were 42 people who died in 2020 to 21 during the COVID era.
Well, we know COVID did ravage prison systems. Was COVID-19 itself responsible for most of those deaths?
COVID was the factor singularly most responsible for the deaths. There were 18 COVID-related deaths in that time period. But I think our more stunning finding was that this was a systemic issue. There were 24 non-COVID-related deaths that occurred in the time frame between parole approval and when someone should have been released this year. But importantly, we also compared this data to the year before COVID. And we found that in the year before COVID, there had been 26 deaths among parole-approved people. And what that's telling us is that there are many reasons for deaths that have nothing to do with COVID. When we looked into the cause of those deaths, we found out that most of these people had chronic health conditions, such as cancer and heart conditions, and that led to their deaths.
As you say, even before the pandemic, there were delays for those paroled and examples of death. How much did COVID exacerbate the delays, and what takes so long in general?
Well, what we found was that even before COVID, people were remaining in Texas prisons for an average of 3 to 4 months after their parole approval, but before they were released. And during the pandemic, The typical delay in release ranged from 5 to 11 months, with an average of about 6 months. So we had an almost doubling of the delay in release. That's because people who are approved for parole are often required to take some pre-release programming by the parole board before they can go out the gates. And that programming is not available to them until after they've been approved for parole. And many of those programs had either been put on hold or were significantly delayed because of the pandemic.
I mean, months, though, is that normal? Do we have anything to compare this to or to find out whether Texas is unique in that time period of a delay?
It was beyond the scope of our project to examine all other states' practices, but we certainly found that in other major states, New York, for example, programming occurs at a much earlier stage of a person's incarceration period. And that's frankly what makes sense. You want people to be getting the programming that they need at an early stage, first of all, so that when they're approved for parole, they can be released at that point in time, and we don't incur additional delays or additional expenses. But also that programming could help improve their behavior while they're incarcerated. But because of those delays, taxpayers are, it's costing taxpayers about $750,000 per day to keep these people behind bars.
I was going to say, if there's not a human factor here that convinces folks listening, it's that price tag. The number you found was rather significant.
Absolutely. And this is both a human issue and a matter of trying to prevent a very significant human death toll, but it's also an incredible cost issue for taxpayers. When we're seeing price tags of $750,000 per day to keep people locked up after they have been approved for parole, there's something really wrong with that system. It's a systemic issue.
Michelle Deitch is a senior lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the UT Law School. Her new report on parole waits during the pandemic was released this month. Michelle, thanks so much again.
Thank you again for having me.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Quest Diagnostics, serving physicians and their patients with lab testing services across Texas. More info at questdiagnostics.com. Together for a healthier Texas.
This is the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice, in for David Brown. Along with a call for a new state-constructed border wall, Governor Greg Abbott's focus on immigration includes housing migrants in a state-run prison. And not just any prison, but one that already has a not-so-great reputation. For the details, we turn to Carrie Blakinger, a reporter for the Marshall Project. Carrie, welcome back to the Texas Standard.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you broke this story. What is going on at the Dolph Briscoe unit south of San Antonio in Dilley?
Well, so last week, TDCJ was told that the state was going to be using that unit to house migrants, and they cleared out most of the state prisoners who were there. And I got this tip that they cleared them all out and were allegedly going to hold immigrants there. And I was sort of confused by this because it is not obviously normally what Texas prisons do, but it turns out that as part of this Operation Lone Star, the state is going to use this unit to house people who are being detained pre-trial. For crimes, not immigration, but for whatever sort of low-level crimes people are picked up for at the border, they're going to be using this as essentially like a county jail. So very unconventional use of a prison.
Yeah, so how is TDCJ being affected? I guess these are employees being asked to take on a new role. Can you get into that a little bit?
So the facility holds around 1,300 or 1,400, and what I'm hearing is that they're planning to house about 1,000 migrants there. And, obviously the employees that work at that unit don't have any sort of training on how to deal with this population, which is not convicted of any crime. You're probably going to have more people for whom English is not a first language. I think it's just a different population to work with, and they're not trained in that. So that's one issue. But, there's also the issue of it's not clear. There could be legal issues because, there are statutes that dictate that TDCJ staff can't be guarding people that either are only convicted of a misdemeanor or are accused of a misdemeanor. So it's not clear what level of crime these people are going to be held on. So it's not even clear if TDCJ staff are going to be able to guard them, but that's what they've been told, that they're all staying there and they're just going to guard whatever migrants are sent their way.
Is anyone challenging this right now? I mean, who's raising questions and what are they asking?
So nobody has challenged it sort of formally. I think this is partly because we just don't know who's going to be there yet. Although they cleared out the unit, they didn't bring in the immigrants yet as of Friday, the last that I heard from anyone who was on the ground there. There weren't people who'd been brought there yet, so we don't know what these people are actually accused of, and that would make a difference, sort of the scenarios in which they're picked up and whether they're being accused of misdemeanors or felonies. You know, I've heard some sort of like behind the scenes rumbling from some advocates. I'm actually a little surprised that this hasn't gotten more outcry than it has. I did, Rep. Gene Wu from Houston seemed pretty incensed when I talked to him last week, but I actually haven't heard a sort of, broad outcry in the way that I might have expected.
Well, some of that, like you say, might just be people kind of waiting to see and understand exactly what this will look like. But, I alluded to this at the top that that this unit doesn't exactly have the best history. It's been in the news before. Can you remind us about that?
Yeah, so last year there was a hostage situation there where several men had defeated the locks on their cells and took a guard hostage. They stripped him naked and they didn't actually hurt him significantly though, so it resolved better than it might have. But one of the takeaways here is that the locks don't work on this unit, which is true on many units. So, this isn't a unit that has clearly had public and sort of documented troubles. I don't know how much of that goes away when you bring in an entirely different population of detainees and how much of that is about the culture there with the staff. So it clearly got some structural problems and it seems to have some cultural problems. It might be harder though now to sort of keep tabs on it, because I think when you bring in a population that doesn't have roots and ties to the inmate advocacy organizations that work in Texas prisons, and when you bring in a population that maybe doesn't have English as a first language, I think it's harder for people on the outside and reporters to keep tabs on what's going on.
Carrie Blakinger is a reporter for the Marshall Project. Carrie, thanks again for your time.
Thanks for having me.
We'll continue to follow details of the governor's Operation Lone Star initiative here on The Standard. But as news about the Dolph Briscoe unit developed over the weekend, another story unfolded on the U.S.-Mexico border near El Paso. On Saturday, some 200 families separated by their legal status briefly reunited in the middle of the Rio Grande as part of the 8th annual Hugs Not Walls event. Organizers coordinate with immigration officials to create a space where families can briefly reconnect without fear of immigration enforcement. KERA's Mallory Falk was at this year's Hugs Not Walls, the first one since the start of the coronavirus pandemic.
It's early Saturday morning, and families dressed in bright blue T-shirts assemble on the U.S. side of the Rio Grande. Their relatives are just a few yards away, dressed in white, divided by ankle-deep water and the border wall.
This is really something special for me.
That's Fernando Ramirez. He's 47 and works as a medical administrative assistant in El Paso. He says he hasn't seen his big sister Maria since 2009, when she was deported to Juarez.
We talk, we call each other on the phone, but we beat or chat also, but it's not the same. It's always not the same. It's not when you have her in person where you can actually touch her and, hug her and stuff.
This year's the first time Fernando heard about Hugs Not Walls, and he rushed to sign up. Now joined by his wife and 2 young sons, he anxiously peeks through the rust-colored slats that make up the border wall, trying to catch a glimpse of Maria on the other side.
I can't wait for them to call us so I can see her.
The organizers, El Paso nonprofit Border Network for Human Rights, say Hugs Not Walls is more than just a chance for families like this to reunite. The group says it's also an act of protest against the policies keeping families apart. It's also a highly visual and emotionally charged scene. The joy of reuniting and the pain of forced separation are on full display.
Gracias. El siguiente bloque de familias lista.
It's finally Fernando's turn, and his family walks down the concrete bank of the river and onto a wooden platform. Maria approaches from the other side. Tears stream down their faces as they wrap each other in a tight hug.
My dad's crying right now.
6-year-old Derek looks on for a moment, then suddenly realizes what's happening.
Wait, is that your sister?
This is the first time Derek's ever met his tia.
Hi.
He throws his arms around Maria's waist and buries his head in her chest. She pulls down her mask to give him a kiss.
This is my sister. I haven't seen her for almost 12 years. Very happy now, very joyful. I mean, even though it's for a few minutes, but I'm very happy to see her. I'm very happy to see her.
For Maria, it's overwhelming.
I feel so sad.
She says the separation's been hard. Her whole family's in El Paso, and she's by herself in Mexico.
Listo, siguiente bloque, listo.
After 3 minutes, an announcement booms over the loudspeaker.
Tiempo, ya familia, tiempo.
It's time for the next round of families. Maria gives her nephews one last squeeze. Then she and her brother walk back across the river to opposite sides of the border. I'm Mallory Falk, reporting from in between El Paso and Juarez.
I'm Fresh.
I'm Confucius.
Every Saturday night we host The Breaks, the hottest hip-hop show in Austin.
And now you can hear weekly highlights on The Breaks podcast.
Both of us are native Austinites and we love talking hip-hop. Texas hip-hop history, what's going on right now. We love it all.
Subscribe now at kutx.org/The Breaks or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice, in for David Brown. U.S. intelligence officials are set to release a report later this week that could shed some light on recent sightings of what are being called UAPs, or unidentified aerial phenomena. The question of what these objects are is likely to remain a mystery, but some scientists are looking at the evidence. Texas Public Radio's Jerry Clayton talked with a physicist who has done some serious study on the subject.
In case you may have missed it, a big news story has been bubbling to the surface.
Unidentified aerial phenomena.
Unidentified flying objects descending.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the
U.S. Navy has confirmed that several recent photos and videos
UAPs hovering
newly
over
leaked
restricted
video
areas.
taken aboard a U.S. Navy ship appears.
In 2017, the U.S. Navy confirmed that earlier leaked videos did in fact show what they call UAPs, or unidentified aerial phenomenon. The Pentagon has admitted they've been studying them, and recently NASA has announced its own investigation. So it seems as if the government is concerned about the national security threat these phenomena may pose. Academia has been slow to take up the subject, possibly for fear of ridicule, but even that is changing.
My name is Professor Kevin Knuth. I'm Associate Professor of Physics at the University at Albany.
Among other things, he is a former NASA research scientist at the Ames Research Center. Professor Knuth authored a paper called Estimating Flight Characteristics of Anomalous Unidentified Aerial Vehicles. It included case studies from 1951 to present day, which included sightings of objects near the Nimitz aircraft carrier in 2004. All the reports consist of reliable eyewitness testimony and, more importantly, corroborating radar data. In the Nimitz case, objects were tracked on radar several times, descending from 28,000 feet, which is about 5 miles up, down to sea level in about 0.7 seconds. How fast is that? Knuth did the math.
So those accelerations we estimated were on the order of about 5,000 Gs, which is 5,000 times the acceleration of gravity, which is really crazy. Our fighter jets can really only handle about 13 Gs before the wings get ripped off.
He says at midpoint on the way down, the craft would have been traveling at approximately 35,000 miles per hour through the air and without a sonic boom. Knuth says he's disappointed there has not been more serious study done by scientists.
For me, it's a little disconcerting. We've had 70 years 3/4 of a century where we've had these things flying in our airspace. They show up in military bases, they show up over nuclear weapon sites, and virtually nothing is known about them. And I look at this as probably, I think eventually when we finally learn what these things are, this is going to be one of the greatest intelligence failures in history.
What does Knuth believe is the most likely explanation of these UAPs? He says it might be reasonable to assume they're built by a government or an aerospace company.
Except for a few important points. One is the accelerations are really anomalous to the point where it's really not clear how the physics would work in that case. So whoever's been making these things would have had to not just have one technological leapfrog, but it would be multiple technological leapfrogs. And that would be quite surprising. And it would be surprising to have a company or a nation who has this technology but doesn't use it. And more importantly, these things have been observed before people have been able to fly.
There are skeptics. Some say these sightings are actually low-tech drones or even balloons launched by adversaries that are fooling the observers. It's clear, though, that the government is concerned. The Director of National Intelligence has been directed by the Senate Intelligence Committee to work with the Defense Department to produce a report on UAP sightings by June 25th.
I expect that there probably will be a public component to the report and a classified component to the report. And the public component will probably leave things a bit up in the air, whereas I would hope that the classified version would actually have more information.
Knuth says if the report hints at anything other than worldly technology, information will be slow to be released.
Some of this might be a little too shocking for us to handle all at once, so they might instead try to, ease us into it a bit.
I'm Jerry Clayton in San Antonio.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. It's time again to check in on what you all have to say about all of this. Social media editor Wells Dunbar is back. Hey, Wells.
Hey, Laura, getting hungry there?
Getting
I think you know where I'm going with this one. The story is a Chicago businessman gets thanks for serving up another helping of Luby's cafeterias by coming in with a last-minute offer to buy several of the ailing restaurants. I think I might have said it was a Texas businessman earlier, but no, Chicago to the rescue here. The Valley Morning Star reports that one Calvin Jen, who operates an airline food company, flew in under the radar with a last-minute offer to buy the majority of the Luby's assets, and they were slated to be closed, liquidated, sold off to pay the creditors there. So now 32 existing Luby's locations, all in Texas, slated to remain open so Texans can go there and make their way in for another Luann platter at the time and place of their choosing, it appears. So lots of rejoicing in the land with this news. John Kashikati says that he's going to stop in for some liver and onions, and at his age, a Luann platter would just be fine. I think, what's that? You get the one protein and maybe two sides. I can't remember.
You don't want to know. You don't want to know. I've never been to a Luby's, so I know.
Wow.
I know.
Well, it's cool.
Apparently, I
understand,
have the chance still to make up for my sins.
I know, and I think you're probably going to get roasted here in the Texas Standard staff meeting in about 1 hour. But full disclosure, we were a Furs family growing up in El Paso as well. Dearly departed the chain cafeteria as well. But a lot of it is, I think what we're talking about. If you haven't been there, you're probably not that excited. I think a lot of it really does come down to nostalgia. Just judging by some of the comments we're seeing, the people pushing around the tea carts and whatnot. Ken Wheatcroft Pardue. He says cafeterias are uncool and probably politically incorrect for all I know. But I love them. And that sentiment being reflected by a lot of our friends and listeners out there. So too late for some locations, but an interesting reprieve there for the ones that will continue to stay in business. Interesting.
All right, well, now we got to change the subject since we know I have no more to say about it.
I know. Laura Rice in the hot seat there. Sorry about that. Well, we're continuing to hear about, the sort of aftermath, if you will, of the Texas legislature. Heard about the response to the governor's veto of that bipartisan legislation protecting dogs, banning the heavy chains that unfortunately you see some animals chained up with outside. People making hay out of some of the other vetoes that the governor issued. A bill to teach children about domestic violence in Texas schools also vetoed. We went deep on that yesterday. We talked about that some with a guest on the program. But again, it's interesting to see how this information sort of comes out in waves online and sort of, if you will, a new cycle of outrage sort of begins with each a new group of people that hears this information. So continuing to see lots of reactions about that, and again, just on several other vetoes from the governor there, Laura.
All right. Thank you so much, Wells. Thank you for listening. See you back here tomorrow.
Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, and the George Huntington family.
What do you want to know about Austin? Our AT Explained project takes your questions about Austin's people, places, and things and goes the distance to answer them. Subscribe to the AT Explained podcast. Find it on iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite podcast app, or go to atexplained.org.